Now I'll continue from there only. You have learnt about the Gomastas. There is a question also expected from there. So now we will talk about the weavers and their life. What were their reaction? So how the weavers reacted? I gave one question on this also. So they were much exploited during that time. So what we find that in many places in Karnataka and Bengal, we have seen that weavers deserted villages and migrated to some other places where they had some family relations and all. Secondly, weavers, along with the village traders, they revolted opposing the company and its officials. So some revolted also. And thirdly, over time, many weavers, they began refusing loans. They were no longer now accepting the loans given to them and closing down their workshops and taking to agricultural labor. This is on page number 116. Now children, we will discuss about Manchester comes to India. Now this means that they had developed their own cotton textile industry. From the very beginning, we had seen that Indian cotton textile was in high demand in the international market, and Britishers, they wanted to capture this textile industry, and for that they had adopted economic policy, and finally we find there was a decline of Indian textile in the international market. So this is what we are going to study in this topic, that how and why did this happen, what were their policies. And we have seen that it was believed by them that the demand for Indian textile could never reduce, since no other nation produced goods of that same quality. But yet we find that the beginning of the 19th century, there was a decline of textile exports from India. Now underline this line. Now what is the reason for this decline? We are trying to understand that. Now, a colonial industries, number one, because they had developed their industry in England, that is in Manchester. Industrial groups, now after developing their own industry, they were finding it very difficult to compete with Indian imports. So, what they suggested, the industrial groups, that is the British industrialist groups, they began worrying about imports from other country. Now because they could not compete with Indian cotton textile, so they pressurized their government to impose taxes, import duties on cotton textile which was coming from India. Now what is that imposition of import duties? It means taxes on the imports. Whenever the taxes are imposed on the imports, it becomes very costly. So when it will enter in Britain, then their goods, Indian goods, will be much costlier. So people will prefer to buy the British goods only, that is Manchester's cotton. So this was one policy adopted by them, to impose taxes on the imports of the goods. Now again they pressurized Manchester goods could sell in Britain without facing any competition if they impose imports taxes. At the same time, secondly, they also persuaded the East India Company that to sell the manufactures in Indian market as well, to sell their manufactured clothes in India also. So exports of British cotton goods increased dramatically. Now, with this new economic policy, now these are two important lines. This is the policy they adopted, and that resulted into the decline of the textile exports from India, and this resulted into the decline of the cotton textile industry. Exports of British cotton goods increased dramatically. Indian markets were flooded with the British manufactured goods, and these manufactured goods were cheaper also, and people prefer to buy those goods. At the end of the 18th century, there had been virtually no import of cotton goods from India. Cotton weavers in India, thus, they also faced many problems. So this is the economic policy adopted by them to that resulted into the decline of textile exports from India. Now we are proceeding to the next topic, that weavers. Now this whatever we are discussing about weavers, you can add up these points when you write about the life of the weavers or how their life was affected. Now, the cotton weavers in India again faced many other problems. Their export market collapsed because now no longer their things are now no longer demanded in the international market, and the local market also shrank. So, twin problem. In the international market there was no demand, in the local market also, because local market people prefer to buy those manufactured goods which were very cheap. Being glutted with the Manchester imports produced by machines at a lower cost, our imported cotton goods were so cheap that weavers could not easily compete with them. So weavers were finding it very difficult now India to survive, because they no longer could compete with the British manufactured goods. So this is the economic policy, and this is also we are talking about the life of the weavers. By 1860s, we were faced another problem. They could not get sufficient supply of raw cotton of good quality, because good quality was all collected by them. Only coercer was left here, and that was no longer demanded by the rich people or aristocrat people. That was demanded by the poor people, and that demand always fluctuated. So there was no demand for their products. When Civil War broke out in America, the cotton supplies from USA were cut off and Britain turned to India. As raw cotton now they started collecting, exports from India increased, the price of raw cotton also shot up. Weavers in India now they also faced another problem. They could not buy raw cotton at exorbitant prices. In this situation, you can imagine how weaving could survive. These weavers could survive. So, by the end of the 19th century, weavers and other craftspeople faced yet another problem. Factories in India began production, flooding the market with machine goods, so their things were no longer in demand. So, this is how their life was affected. So, children, I have already told you that there are many questions from this particular topic, and each topic I am reading out here is very important. Small questions comes, objective questions, and even the long questions, and all my assignment today is based on the topics which I am covering up today. All the sources, kindly read it, and all the sources, like here I can see source C, source D. It is not necessarily that every time the question will come from there. Just give a reading, and in case you have any problem, kindly underline, so when the school reopens we can discuss those also. Thank you.